So by watching the animals, the native people knew when the environment was changing. They knew when it was going to get too hot or too cold, or and to be prepared. That's why they always had food stored in the ground, because in the ground it kept cool and it kept it dry, because they lined it with clay, and they would put a fire in there and that would bake it, and it would be in-ground granaries, right? They're still finding some. There was actually a pot that was filled with like a soup or stew that was found in the ground in Alberta, and they found it perfectly preserved, right? So things that are in bogs and that as well. I know my auntie probably has upteen things buried in the ground around Fort McMurray. I was with her one time, and she stops and she starts moving the leaves, and I'm watching her, and holy smoke, she grabs a handle and it's in the ground and she pulls it up. Well, she buried a freezer in there in the ground. She's like, well, she couldn't get the clay to bake a in-ground thing, but she found an old freezer and dug the hole and gutted the freezer from motor and everything and sunk it down in there, and that became her storage, right? And with a heavy enough lid, nothing's gonna lift it up or even smell it, right?
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm sure she's got a few of those out there. She lived out there all her life, and we talk about people that live on the land. She literally lived on the land to the point that she knew every herd that came through of deer, and knew the parents of the deer. So she knew which ones to hunt and which ones to leave, which ones were the young ones. And she was amazing, because when people say, well, I've lived on the land, but I don't know every tree. Well, that's because you're in your house. And to her house was somewhere where you went to sleep, right? And that was it. And the rest of your day, you spent it outside. So she did know her land. She was one of the last women trappers, as well as very well known in Fort McMurray as not just a trapper, but a bush medicine woman as well. My grandmother was. She was a midwife. And so by living out there, she would see all these things, and how the interaction between animal and human. And one crow kept stealing from her traps. So she went and she caught him. And how she caught him was, with her own traps, with the cage type thing. And she put him in a cage. And for a week, she would take her stick and rattle that cage. And you stop stealing from my traps. And then she let it go. And it never stole from her traps again. Yeah. But so she could tell when something's been at her traps, right? She could tell the difference between certain prints in the snow and such. And she was a very wise and strong woman. There's an old story too on how they would go to visit her because she was elderly, and had to go check on her once in a while because she lived out in the bush, right? And they usually send in a new guy, and tell him, here, use the bullhorn and just ask if she's okay. Well, as soon as he would yell, Mrs. Sanderson, are you okay in there? And she would shoot right by him. And he was like, that crazy lady, she's shooting at me. And they were like, if she was shooting at you, you'd be dead, because she's a sure shot. Okay, that was her way of saying, yes, I'm okay. But they wouldn't tell him at first. So it was a little bit of an awakening. But there again, it's a lot easier to take it, make a shot than it was to yell back to him that, yeah, I'm okay.
It travels faster than a sound wave.
Exactly, right? So, so she was quite the woman there. So knowing that, and when I met her, I said, well, how come, how can I share these stories? And when? Because it was still back in the 80s. it was still hard to do any knowledge sharing because there again, it seems as if people think we're lying. Like, you're not telling the truth. That's bullshit. That squirrel didn't do that. And yeah, you watch the squirrel and they do.